They look different, but they're exactly the same. Hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel. And today, we have quite an interesting topic. We're going to be talking about video game consoles and how in different regions they are different. I want to set some guidelines first, just so it's easier. We're going to be talking a lot about PAL and NTSC. And I'll explain something really basic. So, in America, most of us are familiar with NTSC video, which is, it's basically our video standard here for broadcast TV. In Europe and other countries, they use something called PAL. And basically, the way that video works is, when we talk about NTSC or PAL, what we're really talking about is the color. Before color, black and white TV, there was no such thing as two different standards. There was a different refresh rate, since Europe is, and a few other countries are 50 hertz, and America, Japan, and a few other countries are 60 hertz. The refresh rate is different, but most of the stuff would work on both, black and white TVs or anywhere. But when we started going into color, we had three, but two main competing standards. We have NTSC, which is what we use in North America, Japan, Korea, and most of South America. And we have PAL, which is what they use in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, and most of Asia. I don't know if one is better than the other. NTSC is, main resolution is 720 by 480 at 60 hertz, and PAL is 720 by 576 at 50 hertz. Now, the 50 hertz will come into play later, and I'll explain why. Although there is such thing as PAL 60, so you can get 60 hertz out of PAL, but usually PAL is 50 hertz. There's also CCAM, but CCAM basically only exists in France and Russia. I don't really know of any other CCAM countries, but those are the two main ones. But France is basically the only CCAM country. I don't know why they decided to be different. Probably because they're France. But most of the stuff that we're talking about when it comes to PAL versus NTSC is color encoding and refresh rate, since PAL is a lower refresh rate. But most of the ARTs since the 90s actually can display both PAL and NTSC, and it only applies to composite cables, as RGB and I believe S-Video actually can be either NTSC or PAL, and TVs will accept it. And in the digital age, where we're all using digital TVs and analog to digital converters, none of this really matters. If you have an NTSC TV or American TV, you could probably display PAL just fine. It's only really old analog stuff that this applies to. So without further ado, let's get into it. And first, we're going to start off with the NES. And I'm not going to lie, most of this video is going to be about the NES, because holy crap, was this a mess of research. So we'll start off with first, and the one that people probably know is a different variant of the NES, or technically vice versa, is the Famicom. So the Famicom was released in 1993, the family computer. This is Nintendo's first ever home console with interchangeable cartridges. It sold amazingly well in Japan, but when they tried to bring it over to America, we had an issue. In 1993, the American video game market collapsed. No one was buying home video game consoles. Arcades were doing just fine. Even Nintendo in America was doing just fine with Donkey Kong in the arcades. That's a whole different story for a different day, though. But it wasn't going to work. They knew that no one would buy video game consoles, so they changed the system. Well, okay, they did a few things first. They first tried to do the advanced video system, which was kind of like an NES, but it had a keyboard and a cassette deck and some wireless controllers and a wireless zapper gun. And this was to make it look like a computer, since computers at the time were doing pretty good, and even games on computers themselves were actually doing pretty good. But pretty much everyone saw right through this, and they saw that it was just a video game console pretending to be a computer. Although in Japan, for the Famicom, there actually is a keyboard, a cassette recorder, and I think there may have been a modem. I'm not 100% sure. But there was a cartridge you'd get called Family Basic, and it was like a really basic, literally basic operating system that you could program the Famicom with a keyboard. So It wasn't. I don't know if this came from the advanced video system or if they used the Family Basic to make the advanced video system. I don't know. It didn't work anyway, and I don't think Family Basic was really that big of a thing. So they redesigned the NES to look like a VCR, and they came out with Rob the Robot. And the reason they came out with Rob the Robot was to make the NES, or the Famicom, I guess, look like a toy. That is why it is not a computer, it is not anything, it is a Nintendo Entertainment System. It is not a video game console, it's an entertainment system. And, you know, Rob helped sell that. And, you know, basically, Rob itself was not meant to be like a long-lasting product. The whole point of Rob was that he just existed to get people to buy the NES and think it's a toy. Once they got home and realized, wow, Rob sucks, they were already playing Mario Bros. Or Duck Hunt or any of the other amazing NES games, and word of mouth spread, and eventually they even got rid of Rob the Robot. So because Rob the Robot was basically designed to make... Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. Rob sucked. It really didn't do well outside Japan. It was a Trojan horse. There's a video about Rob the Robot by Gaming Historian. Go watch that. Basically, he did help sell the NES. And by the time people figured it out as a video game console, word of mouth spread. The CEO of Nintendo knew that once people got the Famicom in their hands, or the NES in their hands, they would love it. And he was right. And by the time people figured out it was a video game console, they already loved it, and it was selling amazingly well. Anyway, obviously there are some differences between the Famicom and the NES. First of all, the controllers are removable, whereas on the Famicom they are permanently attached to the sides. I like that the NES has removable controllers. This looks cool, but definitely much better. The cartridges are completely different. I don't know why I didn't bring one out, but these are 60-pin cartridges, and obviously it's a top loader, while the NES cartridges are much larger and go in the front and push down like a cassette, like a video cassette. So just continuing with the current difference in the family computer, or the Famicom, and the NES. The Famicom also had the Famicom disk system, which was basically a floppy disk reader that you would attach to the Famicom. It had more storage and allowed you to play bigger games. It didn't last very long, but some very notable games released on the Famicom disk system first. The Legend of Zelda and Metroid, originally only released on the Famicom disk system. It wasn't until later when they actually came back onto cartridge once the Famicom disk system kind of failed. But yeah, the Famicom disk system also added an extra audio channel, and I think they were actually trying to bring the Famicom disk system to America. Another video by Gaming Historian you should watch, by the way. But basically, it didn't work out in the end. But Sharp actually did make a twin Famicom, which is basically a Famicom and a Famicom disk system built into one unit, which is pretty cool. They're pretty common though, which is pretty good. So I think if you go on eBay, you can probably find a twin Famicom for about $100. I don't know if they're any more reliable than the regular Famicom disk system, which seems to be pretty reliable except for the belt, but I hear the belt is pretty easy to replace. I really want a Famicom disk system. I think it looks cool. They're not that expensive, but I don't know if you know this, I got really lucky with my Famicom, and I only paid $30 plus shipping. No, $30 with shipping, and it works, and it looks amazing. I'm so happy I got this. I'll put the seller as well, just because I believe she was a she, and she was just super nice, and I got everything out very fast, and I thank them for that very much. They were very convenient. Also, in Japan, they also had the Famicom TV with Sharp. Sharp and Nintendo really did get along back in the day. It's basically just a TV with a Famicom built in. I think they actually had an NES TV in America. I can't remember 100% if there was an NES TV. I'm 90% sure there was an NES TV. But there was also a Famicom TV in Japan. Actually, there was an NES TV. I'm sorry. The NES TV loaded on the bottom, Famicom TV a little bit different. I think they were both from Sharp though, so yeah. Now, a lot of this stuff, you know, the Famicom Disk System, the NES, you know, the differences, and bring Rob the Robot. A lot of people know that. What people don't know is the NES in Europe and sort of Asia. We'll get to that in a second. The NES in Europe is weird as shit. Pardon my language. So, from what I can tell, because it's all over the place, NES, okay, 1983 in Japan, 1995 in America. The NES, not the Famicom, the NES launched in Scandinavia. So this is Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. It launched in Scandinavia in 1986, okay? This is going to get really confusing, so please bear with me. I'm sorry, I'm trying to explain this as best I can. I do a lot of this shit, and I'm confused. So here we go. So I've done a video. Remember the Game & Watch video? If you haven't watched the Game & Watch video, watch that. This is the thing that Nintendo made before they made the Famicom and the NES. The guy that, you know, the owner Bergsala lied to Nintendo to get the Game & Watch distribution and said his company was way bigger than it was. So he got the Game & Watch distribution for Scandinavia, okay? By committing fraud, basically. So they already had this relationship established with Bergsala, so they launched the NES in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and I think Iceland. Okay. Now, I don't know, again, it's weird. They launched it. There was nothing really translated. They launched the regular NES with the PAL B region. Again, we'll get to that and why it's called PAL B. So they launched that with the PAL B region. Later on, Nintendo wanted to do other European countries, obviously. So in the UK, they partnered, and Australia, and that's not Europe, but they're PAL. So in this instance, they were considering them part of Europe. I know, stay with me. They launched the PAL A region, which includes New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom, and Italy, for some reason. So that was one region of Europe, and the other region, Region B, was the rest of Europe, mostly. We'll get to that in a second as well. So Mattel ported some of the NES games over and made them work with the PAL A region for basically the English countries and Italy. So the Mattel console, which is basically, it says Nintendo Entertainment System, and then it says Mattel Edition underneath it. Whereas the other ones say European Edition, except for the French one, which doesn't say anything. But we'll get to the French NES anyway soon. We'll get there. It's weird, I know. The Mattel Edition consoles and the European Edition consoles are not compatible with each other. They are different regions. There's PAL A and PAL B. Okay, cool. So Mattel was doing the English language PAL countries and Italy with the game boxes in English and Italian, and a bunch of different companies, and I mean a bunch, were doing the rest of Europe. Mostly. Nintendo of Europe did not exist yet, so basically every country Nintendo sold the NES in had a different distributor for the NES. Okay? This is why I was saying it was so confusing. There's a video by the Retro Sofa that you should absolutely watch. It is 1 hour and 20 minutes long, and it is entirely talking about the NES in Europe. Not the Super Nintendo, the freaking NES. This is all one console. Okay. Watch that video. But I'll just explain the highlights. There is the Spanish version of the NES, which is still a PAL B region, but for some reason it says version Española on here, or Spanish version. The game boxes are in Spanish, but it's just a PAL B European NES, okay? The French version doesn't say anything. It just says Nintendo Entertainment System. It's still a PAL B system, but for some reason, they removed the composite and they put a SCART connector on an RGB cable. It's not real RGB. An RGB SCART adapter in the back because I think by law it was required. So yeah, they had a SCART version as well, but I think also they also had to have a CCAM version because, as I said, France uses CCAM, not PAL, so it's still a PAL-B system, but it outputs in CCAM. And because the NES actually cannot output RGB without a mod, it had to convert RGB to composite and then back to RGB. So it's basically a composite output SCART connector. Again, I know it's confusing. I'm trying to bear with me. So the French NES is something special as well. All right, cool. That's Europe for now, okay? We'll get back to Europe in a moment. Now let's talk about Asia. So despite the fact that the Famicom was the Japanese version, mostly the rest of Europe has the NES, but they have not the European version, they have the Asian version, which is basically a NES that says Asian version, and these little black things are gray instead for some reason, and it outputs in PAL because most of Asia is PAL. So, from what I can tell, I'm not 100% sure, but the Asian version of the NES was mainly meant for Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And this makes sense to me, as Singapore at the time was in that region was definitely the richest country, and they had the most disposable income. Malaysia, and also they speak English, meaning that the NES games were already in English and translated. And this is, by the way, this is not the only Asian country we'll be talking about. Malaysia as well can speak English most Malaysian people can speak English pretty well. And Indonesia makes sense as well, just because they're around Singapore and Malaysia. So I can't confirm this, but from what I understand, the NES Asian version was meant for Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Now you may be thinking, well, Jake, there's other countries in Asia. Yes, there is. Korea, at the time, was not allowed to import Japanese things. Because of World War II, Korea didn't really like Japan for very obvious reasons. But Nintendo wanted to sell the console in Korea, so they partnered with Hyundai, yes, the same Hyundai that you're thinking of, to make the Hyundai Comboy, which is basically just an NES that says Hyundai Comboy in Korean. It is not any different other than the logo. It is just an NTSC. I believe it's NTSC. I don't know about the region, but it should be NTSC because Korea is NTSC, so it's probably closer to an American NES than the Asian one. They also made a Super Comboy for the Super Nintendo. We'll get back to that in a minute. In India, another English-speaking country that's PAL, they came out with the Samurai Electronic TV Game System. Again, it's just an Asian NES, so this is the Asian NES again, not NTSC, and they just changed it. It doesn't say Nintendo anywhere. It says Samurai Electronic TV Game System. Okay, we're almost done. We're gonna go back to Europe because it's more towards the 90s. This is actually more after the Super Nintendo came out. There was basically, if you don't know anything about 90s Eastern Europe, it was a very bad time for Russia. Basically, I think it was a bad time for most of the post-Soviet states economically, but they all gained their independence from the Soviet Union, so I think they were all pretty happy about that. But for Russia, it fucking sucked. And during this time, there was a company named Steepler that basically bought a bunch of Famiclones. And what a Famiclone is, it's basically a knockoff Famicom. They had a bunch of Famicones, and they called it the Dendy, and they sold it as a console. And it was just basically a knockoff Famicom they sold that was like a branded knockoff Famicom. Anyway, Nintendo, because this is before Nintendo Europe was really established, decided not to sue them, shocker I know, under the condition that Steepler sold the Super Nintendo in Russia and other Commonwealth independent states countries. So they obviously agreed, and they tried to sell the Super Nintendo in these countries, and Nintendo allowed them to sell not legit NES consoles, but knockoff Famicoms, which I find funny that even after agreeing, they still sold the knockoff ones with Nintendo's blessing. Also, more than 30 years later, they're still knocking off other people's things and calling it their own. Also, I find it kind of funny that even though these like knockoff brands are supposed to be like retaliation against the West, saying we don't need your Western things, they write them almost exclusively in English except for the McDonald's ripoff. Like, you don't even use your own letters that are unique to your part of the world, or the Eastern European world. You use the Latin letters. Like, almost like you know what you're offering is inferior and you're trying to replace it with something. Makes you think. Also, they spelled the IKEA knockoff wrong. It's supposed to say Swede House, but it says Swed House. Okay, back to Asia now, because we're going to talk about Hong Kong. And basically, I'm going to say this. Hong Kong, okay, more complicated, but this is more not complicated because of video games, complicated because of geopolitical stuff. Hong Kong was a British territory until the year 1997, okay? In 1997, Hong Kong went back to China. But because Hong Kong was part of the British Empire, it has some different rules, and to this day, Hong Kong is still part of China, but it's not China. It's not mainland China. It has its own rules, it has its own passport, it's got its own plug. They don't even drive on the damn side, the same side of the damn road. Hong Kong drives on the left, the rest of China drives on the right. There's a bridge that crosses in between. So, same country, not really. They have elections, China doesn't. Anyway, Hong Kong initially got the NES like the rest of Asia. It was an Asian NES that's PAL. That's PAL, that's it for PAL. It's the same Asian NES, which is called Hong Kong Edition. It's a Hong Kong Edition, but basically Asian NES from before. Okay, but Hong Kong, and I believe, and I 100% believe this because Singapore is like this too. Hong Kong has a strong tendency to import stuff, meaning even though they sold the NES in Hong Kong, people were importing Famicoms. Okay, so not many people were buying the NES, but they were buying import Famicoms. So Nintendo changed to selling the Hong Kong Famicom, which, okay, was not a PAL console. It outputted PAL, but it was not a PAL console. It was an NTSC console that converted the video output to PAL, but internally it was an NTSC console, and it even had a switch on the back to let you play the games at 50 hertz or at 60 hertz. So it played, Japan uses NTSC, it's a different NTSC, but NTSC. It played NTSC Japanese Famicom games at 50 hertz or 60 hertz. So as far as I know as well, this is the only other, Hong Kong is the only other country to get the, it wasn't a country at the time, it was part of Britain, to get the Famicom. Everywhere else got the NES. So, it's weird. They got both the NES and the Famicom. Hong Kong has got some weird shit going on, okay? The import thing I definitely know is true because it's not the only country that does it. If you go to Singapore, most of the games are imported. I saw mostly ESRB and PEGI ratings when I went to Singapore and I went into game stores. So that's a whole thing. Hong Kong is exactly like that as well. It's mostly imports. Okay. We're gonna move on now, and we'll bring up Hong Kong again. Trust me, when we're talking about the Super Nintendo. And speaking of the Super Nintendo, the Super Nintendo. Okay. So it gets a little bit easy here. Sorry for going on a rant with the Famicom and the NES, but let's get back to this. So 1990, Super Famicom launches in Japan. Okay. Some other stuff going on, but basically there was other shit, Satellaview, later on, but for the most part, Super Famicom is Super Famicom. 1991, for whatever reason, redesigned Super Nintendo Entertainment System launches in America in 1991. Okay, I don't know why they redesigned it. I'm happy they did. This is cooler looking than this. Fight me. I know this is not a popular opinion, but the American one looks so much cooler than the Super Famicom, in my opinion. Anyway, 1992, the new Nintendo of Europe, which basically the way Nintendo of Europe, the new subsidiary, is now working, is basically in terms of physical distribution. Besides Bergsala, who is still the distributor, we'll get to that in a minute. With the exception of Scandinavia and Bergsala, basically Nintendo is now doing their own distribution in Europe. And basically the way it works is Nintendo of Europe is in Frankfurt, Germany, and basically Nintendo of Europe does the distribution, but the marketing and the translations are taken care of by different companies in the countries they sell in. So the Italian company does, the Italian translation, a French company do the French translation and the marketing, a Spanish company do the Spanish. You get the point. But the distribution of the actual systems are done by Nintendo of Europe in Germany. Okay. So in 1992, they launched the Super Nintendo, and it's called the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, like the NES, but it uses the Japanese Super Famicom design. Basically, the only difference looks-wise between the Super Famicom and the European and PAL, Australian SNES, the PAL region SNES, is it says Super Nintendo. It has this logo here. Okay, cool. The European SNES has the same design, but technically internally it's different because of PAL. And, actually right here, it says use cassettes with Super Famicom mark only. This actually says PAL systems only in the PAL regions. Okay, cool. For the most part, other than the translations, and if you look at like a Bergsala box for the SNES, it is actually in English, which makes sense. Those countries can speak English pretty well. And then only the instructions are in like Danish and Swedish and not Norwegian for some reason. I noticed that when I was looking at the Northern European Nintendo stuff, it would be in Danish, Swedish, and Finnish, but not in Norwegian. I guess Norwegian written out is very similar to Danish, so maybe that's why. But I don't know. It's still kind of weird to me because probably about at this point they were probably the richest country of all of them. So I don't know. Whatever. But anyway, with the exception of Bergsala, for some reason, still doing distribution, and to this day, Bergsala is actually still the distributor for Nintendo in Northern Europe. So Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Estonia, actually, for that matter, are still under Bergsala. They do all the repairs, they do all the marketing, they do all the distribution. The rest of it is Nintendo of Europe. I don't know why Bergsala is still in the picture. Maybe Nintendo just likes them. I don't know. If you go to the Swedish or the Norwegian website right now and you scroll all the way to the bottom, you will see Bergsala. Anyway, Europe was mostly taken care of. But if we go to Hong Kong again, I kid you not only do they have the Super Famicom and the PAL SNES, they launched them both at the same time. They were by the same company. There is a Hong Kong SNES and a Hong Kong Super Famicom. I believe the Hong Kong Super Famicom is NTSC, and then the Hong Kong SNES is PAL. I don't know why, but they're both the Super Famicom design, so on the outside, the only difference is this. Internally, they're different, as I said, but on the outside, the only difference is what they say. The cartridges look exactly the same, the console looks exactly the same, besides the writing. So yeah, no joke. I don't know, no joke. Apparently the PAL Hong Kong SNES can play NTSC games. I think it's the PAL 60 thing. I don't know. It is so confusing. There is a video by AK Family Home, and I recommend you watch it. Again, he explains it so much better than me, and I don't want to, just explain his video. I would rather you go watch his video. He did a great job talking about it. But we'll talk about Hong Kong again later, because oh my god, they come up again. I've never seen something so confusing. Anyway, not much else to talk about when it comes to Nintendo systems, mostly. At least the home consoles. So the Nintendo 64 DD was an add-on for the Nintendo 64 that only came out in Japan. It had these like cartridges, but they were really CDs. Only like 5 games came out, and it was a failure basically. The GameCube launched almost immediately right after that. We have, speaking of the GameCube, we have the iQ player in Japan, which was basically a GameCube made by Panasonic that also played DVDs. Not much to it. They're kind of worth a lot of that now. But going back a little bit. Oh yeah, and I should say pretty much the Wii U. Well, the Wii U didn't come out in every country because it was sort of a failure. But the Wii U, sort of the same everywhere. And the Switch is, well, besides China, and we'll talk about China right now, the Switch is region free. So meaning there's no differences. Every Nintendo Switch besides China is exactly the same. They just change the plug that comes in the box, and they change the marketing. Anyway, China. China banned video game consoles for a while. So Nintendo still wanted a piece of the pie in China. So they partnered with a Chinese company called iQ, and they came up with the iQ player, which is basically the Chinese version of the N64, but like it's all in the controller. It came out quite a bit after the N64 came out, so it was already older technology at this point. I don't know if it used cartridges or was all internal, but I've never seen one of these things. I've just seen pictures of it. But anyway, it had Chinese translations to N64 games. It's basically the Chinese N64. It's just weird, okay? It's weird. That's not the only thing they did with iQ. They also had the iQ Advance, which was just a GBA. I don't know if it was region locked or not. The GBA itself was not region locked. I'm going to assume it's not. But yeah, they had the iQ GBA. They had the iQ DS and DS Lite and DSi. So Chinese region DS, DS Lite, and DSi. They had the iQ 3DS XL. Chinese 3DS, basically. And now, the game and console ban was lifted, but they still are partnering with Chinese companies, so they are now partnered with Tencent. And they have the Tencent Switch, which is basically a Chinese-only Switch that actually is region-locked to only play Chinese region games. There's not as many games. For a while, there was only like 3, but now there's a lot of Tencent games. I can't find a complete list of them for some reason. Last I checked, there's about 40 of them, but they're mostly first-party Nintendo games that get approved in China. All right, Hong Kong one more time. Thank you, AK Family Home. Please watch this video about Nintendo in Hong Kong. Anyway, when the 3DS came out, Nintendo made a Hong Kong region that is for Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. Okay. Hong Kong was still importing Japanese region systems because it was cheaper, I guess. I don't know why, but they were. So, because Nintendo at this time was weird, I'm sorry for explaining this so badly. There's so much to go through. They were translating some games into Chinese for Hong Kong, and whatnot on the Hong Kong systems, but for some reason it just stopped, and they just stopped translating games, and nothing new was coming out in Hong Kong. Later, you were just basically importing Japanese systems. Later, they released something called the Starter 3DS in Hong Kong, which is basically a regular 3DS with the wireless stuff disabled, okay? It was a Japanese region 3DS in English that played Japanese region games, not Hong Kong games, but now they were selling they went back and even brought some of them and changed the region. They were selling the Japanese region games for Japanese 3DSs in Chinese. And basically Hong Kong was now part of the Japan region. I don't know if the other two were, but for Hong Kong, they were now part of the Japan region, and they were selling Japanese 3DS games in Chinese. Okay. As I said, this is so confusing. Please go watch AK Family Home videos on this. He lives there, and he knows more about this than me. As I said, now the Switch is region free. So even if the game is released in Hong Kong, like with Chinese packaging and whatnot, the cartridges apparently are still from Europe and Japan and America. I don't know. Again, Singapore's like this, but the game boxes, when I saw them, most of them were American and some of them were European. I don't know if Singapore actually has their own Switch boxes. So, yeah. Oh, and I forgot to mention with the Super Nintendo, there's a Super Comboy in Korea as well. I don't remember if it looks like this or this. I think it looks like this. I don't know. It's confusing. Anyway. Oh, fuck. Let's start off with Sega Master System. Okay. So, the same day the Famicom comes out in Japan, Sega releases the SG-1000. Okay. It flops. They then later released the Mark II, and then eventually the Mark III, which is the final version of the SG-1000. Okay. The Mark III later becomes, in Europe and America and Brazil, the Sega Master System. Okay. Cool. There isn't much to it. Master System didn't really do well anywhere except for Europe and Brazil. Didn't do well in America, didn't do well in Japan. I don't think Sega ever did well in Japan, which is weird because it's their home market. Anyway, there isn't much to it, except for the fact that the Master System is still, like, kind of being sold in Brazil. Yeah, it's weird. I don't want to talk about it too much because I feel like this video is getting too long, but yeah, the Master System is very popular in Brazil. There's many videos you can probably find about it. Same thing with the Genesis or the Mega Drive, which we'll get to in a minute, be very popular in Brazil. So yeah, SG-1000 and the Mark III, that's the only differences. Pretty much the Master System looks the same in every region. Anyway, as I said, besides Europe and Brazil apparently, the Master System didn't do very well, so Sega looked to make the next console, and they called it the Mega Drive in Japan and Europe. 16-bit system, had some crazy add-ons, whatnot. So, I think in Japan it also had like a floppy disk drive and a keyboard and like a modem. So, yeah, it was kind of crazy. Anyway, in 1989, they released the Mega Drive in America, but they couldn't call it the Mega Drive for some reason. So they changed the name to the Sega Genesis. And the Sega Genesis sold extremely well, or the Mega Drive sold very well in Europe, not in Japan, and the Genesis did crazy numbers in America. It is probably about the fiercest competition Nintendo had, and it was really their first competition was this thing, the Sega Genesis. Okay, cool. All right, so as we all know, the Sega Genesis had some add-ons. It had the Sega CD and the 32X. The Sega CD is not called the Sega CD everywhere. It is called the Mega CD. And let me just bring this out. Look at this freaking thing. So the Sega CD initially launched as a thing that went underneath the original Genesis or Mega Drive. It was called as I said, it was called the Mega CD in Europe and Japan. And this actually, for some reason, the second Genesis, or the redesigned Genesis, is actually called the Genesis 2 in Europe, or the Mega Drive 2 in Europe. But here it's not. It's just the redesigned Sega Genesis. You know, same thing. I think the Mega CD2 is also like this redesigned Sega CD. That's not the original, since this is the redesign. It's called the Mega CD2. I don't remember. They also had the CDX here, which is called, I think, the Mega something. It's like the Mega disc drive or something like that. Sorry, I can't remember. There's been so much going on here. Yeah, not much to it. I don't think the 32X released anywhere but America, so that's something. I guess we got this piece of shit. So not much to say here. I know, like, I said a lot about the other ones, but there just truly isn't much different between the Mega Drive and the Genesis, other than it's region locked for some reason. Other than the name, that's the most different, and some of the color schemes were different. I think this is more like a gold color in Europe and Japan. I don't know why they did, but it is. So yeah, the Mega Drive with the Mega CD2 and whatnot. And also they had something called the, well, we had it to the master, like basically a converter to convert the Master System games to work on the Genesis. But no one in America really had a Master System, so we got I think it's called the Power Base adapter, and we got that in America, but we didn't. But it was incompatible with this version of the Genesis, since it wasn't popular enough. But in Europe, they got a version that actually worked with this one, but it doesn't take the cards. So, you know, that's something. And yeah, that's pretty much it for differences for Sega. The Sega Saturn in Japan is white, while the American one is black. As I know, I have a Sega Saturn. I'm probably one of 5 people that still have a Sega Saturn. And for some reason, the Dreamcast logo in Europe is blue and not orange. I don't know. And I have this on here. We had a system in America called the TurboGrafx 16. Pretty expensive system at the time. Yeah. And basically, it's not really the TurboGrafx 16, it's actually the PC Engine. It was a much smaller, it looks completely different. I don't know why they changed the name and whatnot. It's just weird. I feel like every single Japanese console back in the day was changed. They changed the name for some reason. I don't know why. And then I'll just do some quick rapid fire for other stuff. Sony consoles aren't really any different in any region. They're pretty much the same. The PS1, the PS2, the PS3, the PS4, the PS5. They're pretty much the same in all regions, except that circle was the OK button next to the back button. Obviously not the case here. The original, as far as I remember, I don't know if this is true or not because I can't 100% confirm this, but I've heard that when they brought the PlayStation over to America, they had to make the controller 10% bigger for our bigger hands here. That's about one of the only differences I know. And they had this like weird memory card thing with a screen. I think it was called the PS Play. I don't completely remember. And basically, it was a memory card that you plugged into your PS1, and you could take it out and it had a screen, and you could play mini games on it. And the last piece of trivia I have is the Xbox OG controller, you know, the Duke as it was called. Nobody liked it, and the only reason we got that smaller controller, which I think is called the S controller, the E controller, is because they wanted it to do well in Japan, and no one in Japan was going to use that big, bulky controller. So they redesigned it, and then they brought the controller back here to America, and, you know, that sort of became the controller that everyone likes for the original Xbox. But to this day, Xbox is still a failure in Japan, and nobody in Japan plays Xbox. So I am so sorry I rambled so much in this video. It was truly crazy, all the research I have to do. Please watch all the videos I referenced in this video, since they helped me with my research a lot. It was a lot of work to try to find all this stuff. I know, sorry I didn't talk much about the other stuff, but Nintendo is about the one that changed the most, especially with the NES in Europe, good lord. But yeah, I just thought this was a fun video to talk about stuff with. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you liked it. Please leave a like if you did. It helped out a lot. Please make sure to subscribe if you have not subscribed already, and leave a comment with anything you'd like to add, anything I missed, any examples you have, whatnot. Please just leave a comment. I like engaging with you guys, and hopefully you like this kind of content. I probably won't do a video as messy as this again, just because it was such a crazy video. The next video I'm going to do, I know I keep saying this, is probably just going to be on the history of Sega consoles, but I needed to do some more research. I thought that'd be a quick video, but it's being more involved, and I wanted to do this video first. So next week will probably be the Sega console videos. Also, make sure to check out my tech YouTube channel. I've been trying to upload there with some stuff. I just made the Apple Watch unboxing video, and I'm working on another video about Apple and why I think the Apple ecosystem is pretty good and whatnot. So make sure to give that video a look-sees, and thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.